Backstage at a California television studio, the air is thick with heat, cables, and unfinished applause. The crowd is still clapping, but Johnny Cash has already stepped out of the sound. He's walking the narrow corridor, mind quiet, body tired, when a hand suddenly grips his shoulder. It's Elvis Presley, not smiling, not performing, not wearing the face the world expects. Elvis doesn't speak right away. He simply guides Cash away from the noise, into a corner where the walls seem closer and the silence heavier. His voice, when it comes, is low, controlled, almost careful. He asks one question, not about music, not about television, not about fame. Johnny Cash answers honestly. Years later, he would say, "Of all the conversations I ever had, that one never left me. Because in that moment, I realized Elvis wasn't confused. He wasn't blind. He was standing on the edge. And he knew it." Pause. But to understand why that question was asked, you have to go back to what Elvis had already lost long before that night. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The late 1960s did not feel triumphant for Elvis Presley, no matter what the newspapers said. From the outside, his name was still untouchable. Radio stations played him out of habit, studios treated him like a monument, and strangers lowered their voices when he walked past, as if volume alone might crack something sacred. But monuments don't breathe well. And Elvis, standing just off a soundstage in Memphis, felt every breath scrape on the way in. He had come back from the army older than he expected, disciplined in ways that didn't suit music. Hollywood followed. Bright sets, polite scripts, songs written to offend no one and move nothing. Control slipped away quietly, without a fight. Decisions were made for him, then around him, until one day he realized his name was being used to justify choices he no longer recognized as his own. He didn't complain. He just slowed down, talked less, listened more. That frightened people who depended on his enthusiasm. Johnny Cash, meanwhile, had already burned through the worst version of himself and survived it. Rehab had not made him holy. It had made him clear-eyed. His voice still carried gravel and regret, but there was a steadiness beneath it now. Starter. The Johnny Cash Show. He invited who he wanted, sang what he believed, and argued with executives without raising his voice. He had nothing left to prove, which made him dangerous in a way fame never could. Elvis watched this from a distance, not with envy, with calculation. He noticed how Cash stood on stage, feet planted, shoulders heavy, no rush to charm. How silence didn't scare him. How he said no without apologizing and yes without bargaining away pieces of himself. Elvis had once done that too, before the world decided he should always smile, always agree, always deliver. The '68 comeback special had been a crack in the wall, leather instead of uniforms, sweat instead of polish. For a moment, Elvis had felt the old heat, the sense that the music still answered him directly. But moments pass, systems remain. Cash, on the other hand, seemed to have built a life that bent around truth instead of schedules. That difference lingered. Backstage one night, Elvis sat quietly while others talked for him. He nodded when expected, laughed a half-second late. His hands rested motionless on his knees, as if he were conserving something vital. Across the room, Cash spoke sparingly, but when he did, people adjusted their posture. Elvis didn't see a role model. He saw a question with teeth. And somewhere between the hum of equipment and the practiced cheer of professionals doing their jobs, Elvis realized he already knew what he needed to ask. What he didn't know, what truly unsettled him, was whether he was prepared to live with the answer once it was finally spoken. The corridors behind the television studio were never meant for honesty. They were narrow by design, built to move bodies efficiently, not to hold conversations that mattered. Cables snaked along the floor like quiet warnings. Someone laughed too loudly near a dressing room door. The air carried the mixed smell of cigarettes, hot lights, and nervous sweat. The scent of people pretending nothing important was about to happen. Elvis moved through it slower than everyone else. not because he was tired, though he was, but because speed invited interruption. Assistants hovered, waiting for cues that didn't come. He acknowledged them with a look that asked for space without explaining why. It worked. Fame still had its uses. Johnny Cash leaned against a wall nearby, jacket open, hands relaxed at his sides. He had finished what he needed to say for the cameras. Off stage, he conserved words. When he noticed Elvis approaching, he straightened slightly, expecting the usual exchange. Some dry humor, a compliment, maybe a shared memory polished enough for repetition. Instead, Elvis stopped beside him and said nothing. The silence stretched past politeness, past comfort. It pulled attention out of the hallway like air from a sealed room. Cash waited, then understood this was not a pause meant to be filled. Elvis wasn't searching for phrasing. He was measuring whether the moment could hold what he was about to bring into it. Finally, Elvis tilted his head toward a service door barely cracked open. No gesture, just movement. Cash followed without asking. Inside, the noise dropped to a dull throb. A storage space, bare walls, no mirrors. Elvis leaned back against a metal shelf, eyes lowered for a second, then lifted, not casually, not playfully, but with an intensity that made Cash shift his weight. "This place," Elvis said quietly, more to the room than to the man. "It's loud everywhere, even when nobody's talking." Cash nodded once. He felt it then, the gravity beneath the words. This wasn't conversation. It was approach. Elvis spoke again carefully. Not about headlines, not about shows. He mentioned schedules that never loosened, people who agreed too quickly, the way decisions arrived already signed. He didn't name the pills. He didn't name the fear. He didn't have to. Cash didn't interrupt. He didn't soften his face. Years ago, someone had tried that with him, and it had nearly killed him. Elvis looked up fully now, straight into Cash's eyes. The hallway noise crept back under the door, impatient, unaware. There was something Elvis wanted to ask. You could see it settling behind his expression, heavy and deliberate. And for the first time since they'd stepped off stage, Cash felt the faint, unmistakable pressure of responsibility, because whatever came next would not be small, and it would not be taken lightly. Elvis didn't raise his voice. He didn't lower it either. The question came out level, almost plain, which made it harder to step around. "Johnny, how did you know you'd gone too far?" He paused, just long enough for the weight to land, and still had time to come back. For a moment, Cash didn't answer. Not because he was searching for something poetic, but because the room had changed shape. That single sentence stripped away the costume, the reputation, the careful distance people kept from Elvis Presley. What stood in front of him now wasn't a king. It was a man standing at the edge of a line, asking whether the ground on the other side still existed. Cash inhaled slowly. He had promised himself never to lie about this part. "I didn't know," he said at last. His voice was steady, but it carried old damage. "That's the part folks don't like. There wasn't a sign, no moment where a bell rang and said, 'Turn around.'" Elvis stayed very still. Cash continued, eyes fixed somewhere past Elvis's shoulder. "I just woke up one day and realized the next bad decision wouldn't scare me anymore. That's when it hit. Fear was gone. And when fear leaves, it doesn't mean you're brave. It means you're empty." The words sat between them, unprotected. Cash shifted his stance, not to escape, but to stay grounded. "I was lucky. Somebody else saw it before I stopped caring altogether. If that hadn't happened..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence did the work. Elvis nodded once, not in agreement, in recognition. He didn't ask for reassurance. He didn't ask what to do. His face showed none of the relief people expect when a hard truth is finally spoken. Instead, there was calculation again, quieter this time, sharpened by proximity. "So, there's no rule," Elvis said softly. "Not a question." Cash met his eyes. "No, just awareness. And even that doesn't guarantee a damn." thing. They stood there longer than either intended. Outside, a stage manager called for someone by name. Laughter rippled down the hall, careless and alive. Elvis straightened. The moment closed without ceremony. He offered no thanks, no promise, no confession. Just a brief look, measured, almost respectful, before stepping back toward the noise. Cash watched him go, surrounded instantly by people who needed something from him. And for the first time in his life, Johnny Cash wondered whether he had just helped a man find his footing, or simply shown him how close the edge really was when there was no safe way back. The conversation didn't follow Elvis out of the building, but it didn't stay behind either. It moved with him quietly, without asking permission, settling into the spaces where habit usually lived. In Memphis, at American Sound Studio, the days blurred into each other. The room was dim, controlled, familiar enough to be dangerous. Elvis arrived early, left late, and spoke less than usual. The musicians noticed first. He no longer filled pauses with jokes or stories. When someone suggested a shortcut, he didn't argue. He simply listened, then made a decision without explaining it. A few people smiled, thinking this meant he was finally relaxed. They were wrong. It meant he was paying attention. He didn't mention Johnny Cash, not once. But something had shifted. He cut people from the room abruptly, then kept others who probably should have been sent away. Not out of strategy, out of instinct. The wrong instincts, maybe. The familiar ones. He was trying to create space, but he didn't yet know how to protect it. The Colonel hovered as he always had, contracts in hand, Vegas looming like an inevitability rather than a choice. There was money to be made, schedules to honor, expectations to maintain. Elvis listened, nodded, and felt the pressure tighten. Cash's way, control, refusal, walking away from deals wasn't available to him. Not now, maybe not ever. Freedom in his world carried consequences that felt heavier than confinement. At night, alone, he replayed fragments of the conversation without hearing Cash's voice anymore. Just the meaning, fear leaving, awareness without guarantees. He didn't draw conclusions. He let the discomfort sit. On the road, Johnny Cash moved from city to city, doing what he did best, staying in motion. The backstage moment surfaced between songs, between interviews, unexpectedly. Not with pride, with unease. He wondered if he'd said too much or worse, not enough. He knew how thin the margin was between honesty and harm. Neither man reached out. Back in the studio, Elvis stopped to take mid-playback. The room froze. Engineers glanced at each other, unsure if they'd made a mistake. He lifted a hand slowly. "This doesn't sound honest," he said. No anger, no explanation. Just a statement that landed harder than any outburst. For the first time in years, he wasn't asking whether the song was good enough. He was asking whether it was true. Las Vegas greeted Elvis like a throne that had never cooled. The lights knew his name. The orchestra waited for his breath. Every movement had been rehearsed so many times, it no longer felt like movement at all. It felt like gravity. In 1970, the return to live performance was sold as a triumph, a reclaiming. And from the audience, it looked exactly like that. Power, control, perfection. From the inside, it felt engineered. Every step from dressing room to stage followed a script written by invisible hands, set lists approved in advance, jokes timed to land safely. Spontaneity allowed only in places where it couldn't disrupt the machine. The applause was thunderous, but it arrived on cue, like part of the arrangement. Elvis felt it hit him and passed straight through. After the shows, adrenaline lingered with nowhere to go. He sat alone longer than before, costume still on, collar loosened, listening to the muffled celebration outside his door. People believed connection was automatic when crowds were that large. He knew better now. Contact required risk. Vegas didn't allow risk. Some nights, instead of music, he watched interviews. Not performances, not songs. Johnny Cash talking. Elvis paid attention to how Cash answered questions he didn't like. How he paused without apologizing. How he said no plainly without dressing it up as charm. There was no performance in it, just boundary. Elvis rewound those moments, studying them the way others studied charts. During one show, without warning anyone, he changed the order of songs, just slightly. A pause here. A breath longer than planned. The band adjusted on instinct. The audience didn't notice, but the room did. Tension rippled behind the scenes like a fault line shifting. Afterward, the response was immediate. Concern masked as professionalism, reminders disguised as advice. Parker's irritation didn't explode. It compressed. That was worse. Even a small deviation had triggered fear in the system. Elvis understood then how fragile his autonomy really was. He wasn't rebelling. He was testing the perimeter. Later that night, exhausted and still wired, he said quietly to an assistant who had known him too long to misunderstand tone, "Johnny wouldn't do it this way." The words carried more than comparison. They held respect, regret, a sharp awareness of distance. Because Elvis could see the choice now, not as a dramatic crossroads, but as a daily erosion. Each compliant night made the next refusal harder. Each successful show strengthened the cage. The audience kept cheering, and Elvis, standing center stage, realized that visibility had never been the same thing as freedom. By 1971, success had taken on a strange stillness around Elvis. From the outside, nothing was slipping. Ticket sales held. Headlines stayed kind. The machine continued to reward him for reliability. That was the problem. Collapse announces itself loudly. Endurance can hide decay for years. Johnny Cash was no longer a presence in Elvis's life in any practical sense. No calls, no meetings, not even a polite exchange of messages through intermediaries. And yet, Cash had become unavoidably present in another way, less like a mentor, more like a question that refused to fade. When Elvis hesitated now, it wasn't because he feared consequences. It was because he heard a voice reminding him what fear disappearing might mean. He started choosing songs differently, not the obvious ones, nothing that would raise alarms. But there was less gloss, less automatic uplift, lyrics that left space instead of filling it. On stage, his delivery slowed. Not laziness, deliberation. He let certain lines hang unfinished, as if waiting to see whether they still belonged to him. People around him noticed but misread it. They called it maturity, depth, growth. Nobody asked whether it cost him something. Backstage, between shows, he asked himself questions he used to avoid. Not dramatic ones, practical ones. How many people could tell him no? How many knew where the limits were and whose limits they were? He didn't write the answers down. He didn't share them. Awareness, he had learned, didn't demand witnesses. Cash, moving steadily through his own circuit, felt an unease he couldn't justify with facts. News about Elvis arrived filtered and polite. Photos showed energy. Reports mentioned nothing unusual. Still, something felt unfinished. He recognized the pattern too well to mistake it for paranoia. Knowing where the edge is doesn't stop you from standing on it. The hardest realization settled slowly for both men in different places. Understanding doesn't operate on urgency. It waits. It allows compromise. It tells you there's time when there might not be. Later, years later, Cash would say to someone close to him, without drama or accusation, he knew. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to, because the cruelest version of loss isn't ignorance. It's clarity arriving without leverage. And by then, both men understood that second chances don't announce themselves as such. They pass quietly, indistinguishable from routine, until they're gone. By 1972, Elvis Presley had become something close to myth again. The tours stretched across continents. Records fell quietly without celebration because records were expected now. On stage, he commanded rooms with precision, every gesture confident, every pause controlled. From a distance, it looked like mastery restored. Behind the curtain, the rhythm changed. There was no single collapse, no obvious fracture, just a steady narrowing. Conversations shortened, trust thinned. The days were managed in fragments, stitched together by routine and chemistry that kept the engine running. What frightened no one was how well it all still worked. He showed up. He delivered. The system responded by demanding more of the same. People noticed signs, but signs are easy to reframe. Fatigue became dedication. Isolation became focus. Medication became maintenance. Each person saw a piece, never the whole, and each assumed someone else was responsible for the rest. That was the unspoken agreement. As long as the show went on, intervention felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. Elvis felt the silence most acutely between songs. On stage, sound carried him. Off stage, the quiet pressed in, thick and unresolved. He rarely spoke about doubt anymore, not because it had disappeared, but because articulating it had begun to feel pointless. Questions require space to answer. His life allowed very little of that. Johnny Cash watched from afar, through articles, photographs, brief clips on television. He didn't need volume to read them. He paid attention to timing, to the way Elvis held a pause, a beat too long, then filled it quickly, as if afraid of what might surface if he didn't. Cash recognized that rhythm. It wasn't musical. What troubled him wasn't decline. It was function. Elvis was still sharp enough to perform, still disciplined enough to meet expectations. That gray area was the most dangerous place to exist, too stable to alarm, too strained to recover unnoticed. Cash understood then what that backstage question had truly been. Not a request, a warning flare. And warnings, when unanswered by action, don't repeat themselves. They fade. One evening, watching a broadcast alone, Cash reached for the volume knob and turned the sound down. He kept his eyes on the screen, studying movement without melody. "That's not the voice that scares me," he said to the empty room. "It's the silence between the songs." And in that silence, he felt the weight of something everyone could sense, yet no one would name out loud. By 1976, time no longer moved the way it once had for Elvis. It folded in on itself. Days blurred, not from chaos, but from repetition so complete it erased contrast. There were fewer questions now. That, more than anything, marked the change. Doubt had required energy. Reflection had demanded pause. What remained was momentum. He still worked, still showed up, still carried the weight of expectation with practiced efficiency. If there was fear left, it no longer surfaced as language. It lived deeper, where naming it felt unnecessary. People mistook the absence of protest for peace. They were relieved by it. There was no dramatic warning, no single night that announced itself as final, just another schedule, another performance, another quiet return to Graceland where familiarity dulled urgency. The tragedy, when it came, arrived without ceremony. That was its most honest feature. When the news reached Johnny Cash in August of 1977, it did not shock him the way sudden loss is supposed to. He sat still, absorbing the words without resistance. Shock is for the unprepared. Grief, for him, arrived slowly, like recognition finishing a thought that had begun years earlier. He didn't speak right away. He didn't reach for meaning. What came first was memory, not of songs or crowds or spectacle, but of a narrow room behind a television studio, of a question asked plainly, without drama, of a man checking whether truth still existed outside the noise. Cash understood then what that moment had been. Not desperation, not a plea. It had been a test, quiet, deliberate, a way of finding out whether honesty still lived somewhere beyond applause. Elvis hadn't been asking how to survive. He had been asking whether anyone around him would answer without lying. Cash closed his eyes and felt the weight of what cannot be changed, not because it was missed, but because it was seen clearly and still allowed to pass. There was no anger in that realization, only a sober, enduring sadness. Some endings announce themselves. Others arrive dressed as routine, and those are the ones that linger longest. In the years after 1977, Johnny Cash learned how carefully memory has to be handled. People wanted stories sharpened into lessons, moments reduced to warnings simple enough to pass along. He resisted that. Not because he was protecting Elvis's image, but because the truth didn't fit into anything instructional. He spoke about Elvis rarely, and when he did, he avoided the mythology. No grand speeches, no dramatic regret. He corrected facts when they were wrong, then let silence do the rest. Those who listened closely noticed that he never framed Elvis as naive or unaware. That distinction mattered to him. With time, Cash stopped replaying the backstage conversation as a crossroads. It wasn't one. Nothing immediate hinged on it. No decision followed cleanly from that exchange. What lingered instead was its purpose. Elvis had not been reaching for rescue. He had been measuring reality, checking whether his internal alarm still aligned with the world outside him. Cash understood that impulse well. When you live long enough inside noise, you begin to doubt your own sense of direction. Sometimes you ask a question not to change course, but to confirm you're reading the map correctly, even if you don't like where it leads. That was the hardest truth to accept. Elvis hadn't lacked insight. He had possessed it fully, perhaps too early, perhaps too alone. Awareness came without leverage, and clarity without permission to act freely on it. The industry, the schedules, the people who depended on momentum, they didn't require denial. They only required continuation. Cash eventually stopped wondering what else he could have said. Responsibility, he realized, doesn't always equal power. Sometimes it only means honesty, offered once without conditions. He had done that. The rest had never been his to carry. Years later, when asked about fame and its dangers, Cash answered calmly, without bitterness. "People think fame kills you," he said. "It doesn't." He paused, not for effect, but because precision mattered. "Silence does," he continued, "when everyone's listening." What he didn't add, what didn't need saying, was that the question Elvis had asked him never disappeared. It stayed because it was unfinished, not tragic, not dramatic, human. It wasn't about dying. It was about whether there was still time, and that question, once spoken honestly, doesn't belong to the past. It waits quietly for anyone willing to hear it.